All right, that's good. Actually, that's a good lead-in because I actually call this little talk I prepared. I just came in from Utah, and I call this, and I'm going to tell you the story about this ridiculous year I've been having and some of the things I've been learning that have actually helped me sort of think about my next steps as a business and so forth. I thought I'd start with this image. Show of hands, how many people in one of these in the audience here? Good, healthy dose of it. And how many people are kind of intrigued about what's going to come next and likely are going to buy a new phone in the next couple of years? You figure most of us will probably end up with a new phone. And of course, these things are packed with amazing technology. When I was down at TED, I got to see Google Glass, which is unbelievable. It's really exciting to think of what's going to happen. And of course, you know, tens of thousands of hours of engineering has gone into these designs, and enormous technologies happen. But you know, I'm an architect, and I'm going to talk about what we do. And I want you to reflect back on the technology of a phone. When you consider the fact, I Googled on Friday as I started thinking about what I talk about. I Googled the word building, and the very first image that came up for me was this one, which was of course built in 1929. Now, Google, when you guys Google, everybody gets a different thing that comes up. I don't know if you know this, but it's, you know, it's filtering based on what our preferences are. And you would think as an architect, I'm Googling architecture all the time, but I still get this as the definition of a building. And more importantly, when I Googled innovative architecture, this is the image I got, which is a building by Frank Gehry, and I'm guessing it's sometime in the 1980s. To me, all his buildings look exactly the same, so I don't really know when this one was built. It could have been last year, but he's been doing this for quite a long time. And you know, what is the innovation in this building is basically a lot of shape making. So I got to speak in New York at the Innovation Conference for Architectural Record. It was a real honor for me. I got to stand on stage with some really amazing world architects. But what they talked about when it came to innovation was just this. It was about shapes. It was about parametric modeling and cool ways of cutting materials to make these things. And I realized I didn't really fit in because the things I wanted to talk about were a lot different. And what I've been up to, and you guys may have seen some of this stuff in the news lately, are wood skyscrapers. Now, the definition, just so you know, of a skyscraper is only 10 stories tall. So it's not that glamorous. But the thing is, I've been talking about 30 stories tall, and we've actually been engineering. I'm going to show you some of these. But we've been actually engineering to build wood buildings 30 stories tall with a real compelling, in my mind, compelling reason of why we need to move in this direction. And what's exciting about it is these ideas and these buildings, this way of building is really the first way to build a tall building that's really happened in the last 125 years. So if you think about it, steel and concrete have been the only way in history to build tall buildings. And all of a sudden, in the last 2 or 3 years, 5 years that we've been working on this, we started talking about a whole new way to build. Now, you would think that that would be sort of a welcome conversation, people really interested in how we're going to do this, but really, for the most part, this is a reaction I get from my peers, right? What on earth are you guys up to? Why are you thinking this way? What's the point? You know, think back to the phone. Every 2 years, we get this amazing piece of technology. We don't think twice about it. In fact, we've come to actually expect it. But in my environment, in the built environment, which I'll explain is an incredibly important environment for all kinds of issues from social to cultural to environmental, for some reason, innovation is really stifled into picture making. And so these two numbers mean a lot to me, and these are the percentages in North America of energy use and greenhouse gas emissions related to buildings. So if you pick up a newspaper, you're going to think that transportation is the #1 issue impacting climate change in North America, but it's just not true. For the most part, for energy and greenhouse gas emissions, those numbers for transportation are about 33% and 29%. So buildings are the #1 thing impacting climate change and energy use in North America. And we obviously have to shift the way we're thinking if we're going to address issues of climate change. So I've started, you know, talking about these new ways of building, and I'm going to frame the conversation. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail today about why we're doing these buildings, but the conversation is really about climate change, which, of course, as soon as you start talking climate change, you sort of face apathy and greenwash and some lip service and some denial. I can't believe that you still get denial, but you do, as I lecture around the world. And I realized as I started talking about the reason we want to move to these big buildings, because wood sequesters carbon dioxide and concrete and steel are huge emitters of carbon dioxide and huge energy footprint materials. I realized that we weren't really getting any leverage in the conversation. And part of the reason is, if you've ever heard these kind of statistics, I don't know, there's a range of statistics, but a friend of mine works for Nike and she does sustainability research. And she told me this great quote, which is 95% of people tell you they'll spend more on a sustainable product, an environmentally sustainable product, but only 5% actually do. That's a huge gap in between what we feel in our hearts and what we spend in our pockets, and that's the issue of why we weren't making leverage in this conversation, in part. And obviously, you know, the whole host of reasons that people think these buildings can't possibly be safe. Speaking of which, how many of you live in a wood frame house? Show of hands. Yeah, I'd guess 80% of you live in wood frame house. How many of you thought when I said tall wood buildings that you immediately thought, wait a minute, aren't they going to burn or fall down? Right, you live in wood houses already, guys. So what I realized is I need to tell stories, right? We all do. I mean, the way we communicate now is so much about the idea of how we can tell a compelling story that relates to the majority of people. And for me, that came back to my kids. If I can't explain to my own kids what I'm doing, have I got something that I can explain to the broader world? And so I started thinking about these ideas as bedtime stories as much as stories. I need to make the language that I speak about the ideas quite simple. And, you know, truthfully, it became quite easy. If you guys, my TED isn't out yet. It'll be out in May, the one from 3 weeks ago. And you know, I talk about the fact that I'm from Vancouver. I live around trees that grow to be 30 stories tall. If you walk through our forest, and when I walk through the forest with my kids, I just show them, you know, do you think it's possible to build a 30-story tall building out of wood? Well, the forest already is a 30-story tall environment. Of course we can do it, we just have to shift, and just so you guys don't panic, we're not talking about cutting down old growth trees, and we're talking about new technologies actually with really fast growth trees. So there's a great sort of environmental story here as well with rapidly renewable woods. So what I've sort of came to is this idea that I need to communicate in a different way. And I'll show you a slide in a few minutes. It's not really about the engineering, it's about the communication. And so for me, in my practice, I have a small practice. I have, well, I guess in Vancouver, we're a medium-sized practice. I have 18 people here in Gastown, and I have 2 now in New York City as our research firms in New York. And I talk about it as triage, just like the medical profession, is that if we've got a problem where half the energy use and half of the greenhouse gas emissions are related to the building industry, then the building industry needs to look at it just like a doctor looks at a major accident. They're going to treat the biggest issues first. And the biggest issue in North America is actually energy use in buildings. But the biggest issue to me worldwide is structure. It's every city on Earth builds buildings in steel and concrete, and if you add up the greenhouse gas emissions of just those 2 materials, they represent 8% of man's greenhouse gas emissions just in steel and concrete alone, almost 9%. So they're huge footprint materials with no alternative. And so our focus was let's triage, let's focus on new ways of building structures. And then I also talk about the moon. And that's that when Kennedy said he was going to the moon, he said, we are going to go to the moon. He didn't say, hey, let's look at some research and do some papers and draw together some people and discuss what we could do in order to eventually get to the moon, right? It was a very different sort of level of ambition of saying, we're going to go to the moon. And so about 4 years ago, I was speaking at the Australian Green Building Council's conference, and I just flat out said, we're going to build 30-story tall wood buildings. It got a little misquoted by the papers, and they thought I was going to do it in Prince Rupert, which if any of you have been to Prince Rupert, you would know. The Australians, they don't really know our geography very well. So anyway, it was the idea that I wanted to stretch the imagination of what was possible. I knew intuitively we could do this, but truthfully we hadn't engineered to that level. Now we have. Now we actually have been able to show that it's very much possible to build at that scale in high seismic zones like Vancouver. So of course, the challenge when you do these things is you got to crawl before you walk and before you run. And so just really quickly, I'll show you some images. This is North Vancouver City Hall. It just finished up. It's one of our projects where we showed the way these new materials, this is the ceiling, or these massive timber products allow us to build in a whole new way using these huge scale panel products that are assembled off-site. You guys can all go here. It's where you pay the taxes, just to the right if you're from North Van. But it allowed us to look at this technology so that we could show just in this two-story building what we could ultimately do next, which we just announced on Friday, if you guys heard, a slightly controversial project, but it has nothing to do with us. This is going to be the tallest wood building in North America, and it'll be built in Prince George. So we just, it's close to Rupert, but, and that will lead us to our next step, which is going bigger and bigger, and we're going to be announcing, I think, right here in Vancouver, the fact that Vancouver is going to lead the world with a building probably twice the height of the one I just showed you, but not quite this tall, because this is a project that we've been working on in New York, which isn't real yet, but we hope will become real. And the reason is that a century ago, when the skylines of the last century were developing, it really was about a competitive spirit between developers and cities, mayors, wanting to be the tallest. And that competitive spirit between New York and Chicago is what actually elevated the skylines and the engineering around the world and made these ideas possible. And so what we realized is, let's just capture that same spirit. We're still competitive people. Surely we can just repeat what we did a century ago, and let's make it a competition. So some peers of mine, a company called Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, SOM, is one of the biggest architecture firms in the world. It's very intimidating for me, but very good. They read my report that I put out a year ago, decided that they think they can do this as well, and decided they'd create an innovation zone in Chicago. So what did we do? We realized, well, that's great. That's perfect. Let's just call Bloomberg and make this happen in New York, and off we go. The race begins. So just 3 weeks ago, I called Bloomberg's office, and we've actually got the beginnings of an innovation zone that are going to allow us to do these buildings, hopefully in New York soon, and Chicago soon, and off we go. And what that does is it creates this momentum. And the momentum, I really feel like we're sort of here now, and we're just about cresting, and it's going to get a lot easier. And part of the reason I feel that is that I've been trying to plant the seeds of the idea that get on board or you'll be left behind. The fastest way for us to encourage these ideas to happen was in part to say, hey, 30 stories is possible, dream and stretch for the moon. We're not going to build that tomorrow, but at least it'll get us thinking that way. And the other was, get on board now or you're going to be left behind. And what we're seeing right now is the biggest contractors in Canada, most architects worldwide now are starting to look at these ideas. And what we've seen is the biggest engineering firms in the world have actually created tall wood building divisions. So Arup, who build most of the Olympic stadiums and most Olympics for the last 56 years, they are the engineers that did the Sydney Opera House, for instance. They, 4 years ago, said this wasn't possible, and 2 weeks ago convened 60 of their engineers worldwide in Germany to talk about how they're going to get on board because they feel like they're being left behind. That idea is how we actually change and create the momentum shift. And the other important part of it was, which was really important to me, is all the work that we did was Creative Commons. So here's the business loop. This is the challenge, right? So I knew that to come up with these ideas, to actually make a difference, we had to Creative Commons everything we did. Luckily, I think everybody here knows what Creative Commons is. I'm still astounded, actually, how many people don't know what that is. But Larry Lessing actually spoke with me at TED, which was kind of fun because he developed Creative Commons. And the idea was that if you plant the seed and say that everybody can use this, pick it up, build on it, but can't profit from it, then obviously it propagates. If we had developed these ideas as copyright solutions, obviously we wouldn't probably see the change. And the way I describe it is, if we had originally had steel construction that was proprietary, one guy profited from it, likely we would never see steel construction today. And the benefit of having done this and being first in, this is the fun part, we are the first to develop these initial ideas, which means that now everybody's stuck with the Creative Commons. They can never change that reality, and hopefully this will just perpetuate. And what's really fun for me is SOM, that huge architecture firm that I mentioned. I mean, they're big guns in the world. They have tried really hard to avoid using anything we've done because they don't want to be stuck with Creative Commons. They've decided they want a proprietary solution, and they just can't figure out how to do it, which is awesome. So the engineering and science is hard, and you know, I have amazing wood engineers here, a company called Equilibrium. If you guys don't know them, get to know them. They're brilliant engineers. It's hard, this is hard, but it's nowhere near as hard as changing society's perception of possibility. That's become my biggest job. And it's weird. I have no training in that idea, but that's the challenge of shifting our imagination. And it's just what I said to you. Many of you live in wood houses but assume this couldn't be true. We're not going to build these buildings like your wood houses. This is whole new technology. But of course it's true, and of course it's safe. But we have to learn these new ways of shifting ideas, and that's been an education for me. This is why my year has been so ridiculous. Our report was released almost exactly a year ago, and it went global. And I'm doing interviews in Helsinki and Bulgaria and weird sort of places I never imagined would ever read anything I ever wrote, but it's been exciting. And what I've learned is a couple lessons that I thought I'd just mention. So the first is don't wait to be asked. As architects, it's interesting. We have little projects. We're sort of mom and pop shop industry. We do our buildings, we move to the next one. I think each time we do a building, it's like planting a seed, right? We're growing a sort of, obviously a city, but we're also growing ideas that should change society. But there's no real business model for changing society. We're just focused on one building at a time. And so don't be asked, don't wait to be asked is really about the fact that we need to wait until somebody hires us before we can actually put ideas into the system. And that doesn't really work well because nobody wants something that, you guys know that great Henry Ford quote of, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses, right? So, so sometimes you have to build ahead of the game. The other question, and I'm going to kind of wrap quick because, oh my word, I'm at 16 minutes. It's close to 7, don't worry. Is if not us, then who? And that's a conversation I have with my team a lot. And that's because this is a statistic that, if you don't know, it's amazing. 1 billion people in the world live in slums, in cities. 1 in 3 people living in a city worldwide today live in a slum. 100 million people live homeless, and this is the big challenge of architecture, but it's not in any architecture magazines. So we've been doing disaster reconstruction work around the fact that the international community has actually been building and propagating slums accidentally every time we have a major disaster. So if you look at what's happening in Haiti, that's the sort of ramifications of the strategy. And just really quickly, because this is the business side of this conversation, and that's that if you are looking at innovation spending in the United States, Canada's not much different. And remember the statistic that half of climate change and half of energy use comes from buildings. This is where innovation money is spent. And you'll notice that there's no little house icon down at the bottom here, right? Buildings are somewhere between the little beaker and the light bulb, and for the most part, it's all about photovoltaics. But the vast majority in the United States is under that gun and the military spending. And so what we realized is, so, unfortunately for buildings represent 0.0001% of US innovation spending, but represent half of energy and half of climate change. Talk about a bad lobbying group. My profession is not very good at lobbying, but we need to learn. Oh, I lost a slide. And then I'm done. But what I wanted to say is that, with this last slide, is that what we realized is with this big pool of money here, we've been able to actually start to work with the U.S. Southern Command and fund who run the U.S. military in disasters, and use their money to basically change the face of architecture. So they're actually funding our research firm in New York because I couldn't find any house along the bottom. And I guess that's the story of my ridiculous year. Thanks.